the truth in all of this? And I put a question up. Everyone wants to know, what's the deal with her and Joe? Where do they stand today? So if you can just kind of clear up all of that, that would be great. I think a lot of viewers would be interested in hearing what you have to say.
Well, first of all, Joe and I have never had a conversation. I've never spoken to him. I've only ever even seen him, I think 4 times maybe in court when he started using our name and we had to sue him for intellectual property right infringement. But I mean, where to even start? I actually went through the documentary minute by minute, and I posted online at bigcatrescue.org/Netflix. And I encourage people to sit down and watch the show and just pause it every minute that I have marked on there. And it'll say, like, you know, here they open up the whole thing by saying that Eric Good is a person who's involved in reptiles and he's in that world somehow. And he's so appalled by the fact that he sees this snow leopard in a van in 100-degree heat in Florida. And yet what he never points out is who the owner of that snow leopard was. It was on the van, but it was in such a fast scene, nobody would have known what it said if they didn't know what that logo looked like. And I went back to check and make sure. But it was Mark McCarthy that had that snow leopard in the back of the van. Well, he uses Mark McCarthy throughout Tiger King as somebody to disparage me. Mark McCarthy's never met me. He had met my husband. My husband bought 2 leopards and 2 regular leopards and 2 snow leopards from him back in the 90s. And he comes in there saying, you know, Don was fearful for his life and there was all this problem in the marriage. And it was like, the snow leopards that Don paid him $10,000 for were a birthday gift to me that year. There was not this scary thing going on. And this was in 1997, the year he disappeared, like 2 months before he disappeared. And so there was not all of this talk of divorce and everything that these people kept alleging. And I think where the whole thing, as far as my relationship with Don, just, you know, so many people have repeated this over the years. And I think they do it because it's a archetype that people can associate with, you know, pretty young woman meets rich man, breaks up the marriage, steals all his money. What they don't point out is that I met Don when I was 19 years old. He was 22 years my senior. He told me his name was Bob Martin and that he worked for a man named Don Lewis, who was just this horrible man. And I fell in love with Bob Martin. Bob Martin was the poor guy who worked at the car lot that Don owned. And we would have to sneak around. So whenever I would go see him, we would stay in a little RV that was there on the car lot. And he would sneak me in. We'd, you know, spend time together, and then he'd sneak me out. And he said he was sneaking me around Don Lewis. He didn't tell me he was sneaking me in and out because he was Don Lewis, because he was married to somebody else. And so I had been in love with him for like 3 years or so before I found out accidentally who he was. And at the time I met him in 81. I think I found out around 83 or so who he actually was. And because I had called, there was a method for me to contact him. I'd have to call the secretary, ask for Bob Martin. They would go get him. Well, he had a new secretary who didn't know who Bob Martin was. And so when I called, she was like, well, could you describe him? Because we have nobody here by that name. And I described him and she was like, oh, that's Don Lewis. And so that was how the gig was up with him. But at any rate, when I met him, he had $113,000 worth of property, and he was operating a used car lot where he would bring in trucks and cut the wheels off and then sell the boxes, you know, the big semi trucks. Mm-hmm. So it was not a hugely profitable business. He was not a millionaire by anybody's stretch of the imagination. Back in 1984, Don was, by this time I know who Don is, and I know that he's married, but by this time we've had a relationship going on for 4 years. And I couldn't leave him. I was just so smitten by him. And what I found out later, and was interesting, you know, they pointed out in Tiger King, every woman he ever had an affair with just loved him to pieces because he could make you feel like you were the only woman in the world. He was really, really good at that. In 1984, Don was standing in line at the bank and he overheard a couple of bankers saying that they had this bad mortgage and that it was worth $20,000. And one of the guys said, I would sell it for $2,000 just to get it off our books. Well, Don could barely read or write, but he could understand 20,000 and 2,000. There's some profit to be made in that. So he went to them and he said, could you make copies of that for me and let me think about buying it? So they did. Don brought it to me and I read it and I said, it looks to me like if we buy the mortgage for $2,000, we can do one of two things. We can go to the person who owes the money and say, look, we got this at a huge discount, so we can lower your payments maybe so that you can keep the house. If they still won't make the payments, then what we can do is foreclose on it. We should be able to get $20,000 out of it at the courthouse sale, and we've only got $2,000 in it, so that'd be a great investment. And so we did it. And I think it ended up selling for like $40,000. And so immediately he was like, we've got to find more of this. And so he sent me out to like every bank in a 5-county area. And I would go to them and say, do you have any mortgages that are in default that you'd be willing to sell at a discount? And so that's how I built the real estate business into what was a multi-million-dollar business. But it wasn't because Don had much to do with it other than the fact that he overheard that first conversation. He couldn't get involved in things like researching the deals or going to the closings for the deals or any of that kind of stuff because his ability to read and write was so limited. But at any rate, that was, just one more example of them trying to set me or create, paint me as this person who was stealing all this money from him and his kids. Don had actually divorced his wife in 1990 and gave her $1 million settlement. She said she wanted $1 million and a quick divorce because she wanted to marry a guy at her church. And so Don agreed to that. And then we decided we would wait a full year to make sure she was happy in her new marriage before we would get married. And at the end of that year, actually about a year and a half, we got married. And so from 1991 until 1997, we continued to build the real estate business. And we started the sanctuary in 1992 by rescuing a single bobcat and then rescuing 56 bobcats from a fur farm and then 28 off a fur farm and then 22 off a fur farm. And then people started calling and saying, would you take my lion? Would you take my tiger? I'm like, what the heck are you doing with lions and tigers? And so every time these things happened, I always thought, well, how hard could this be to fix, right? We'll just buy the cat, she won't get killed. We'll just buy the cats from the fur farm, they won't get killed. And after a while, we figured out you can't rescue your way out of this. The only thing you can do is to try and change the laws. And so about 1998 or so is when I started really working hard on trying to change the laws so that people couldn't get their hands on these cats in the first place. Well, that made me a huge bunch of enemies. And you met all of them in Tiger King. Like everybody who ever hated me because I tried to put an end to the way that they were making a living by exploiting big cats. They trotted every one of those people in to say all kinds of horrible things about me that they had no way of knowing whether or not they were true. They didn't know anything about Don and I or our personal lives. And yet they just line them up one after the other to back up each other's story. And no one in the entire show goes, well, how do you have any knowledge of this? And they would have to say they have none, or they heard it from one of the other bad guys. So it was really shameful, I think, the way the producers decided to use that. And there's been a lot of people who have asked me whether or not I thought they were originally caring about the animals and they just got caught up in this, or if they never cared about the animals. And I'd have to say that they probably never cared about the animals, because if you care about protecting animals from exploitation, or you care about ending or preventing the extinction of them in the wild, then why on earth would you go through all of the machinations they had to go through to try and make the one person in your show who was actually trying to protect the cats and trying to save them in the wild? Why would you try to make her out to be the bad guy? There was just no benefit to that if they had any intention whatsoever of protecting animals. So I felt stupid for having believed them so many times when they came to film. But I really feel like even though they did such a horrible thing to me and my family, that the the end benefit of it will be that our federal bill will pass this year. So many of these bad actors who have been abusing cats are now being indicted on their animal trafficking and wildlife abuse charges and all of those kinds of things, that it's finally bringing that entire horrible industry to an end.